Now, the title of the sermon might offend some of you. Our unholy Trinity, anxiety, stress, and overload. After all, how do I dare call our anxiety, stress, and overload unholy? Fair enough. Let's talk about that for a bit. I think there's one thing that we can agree on, and that is that we do experience stress and anxiety and overload, at least one of those, maybe even two, might even be three. Medical, psychological, and biblical scholars agree that we live in a swirl of anxiety and stress, which often overwhelms and overloads us. For example, researcher and professor Dr. Brené Brown writes, "We feel stressed when we evaluate environmental demand as beyond our ability to cope successfully. This includes elements of unpredictability, uncontrollability, and feeling overloaded." So in other words, if what's demanded of us is more than what we think we can handle, we feel stress. John Kabat-Zinn, professor emeritus of medicine at the University of Massachusetts Medical School and the creator of the stress reduction clinic at the same university, puts it this way: a sense of overwhelm happens when our lives are somehow unfolding faster than the human nervous system and psyche are able to manage well. Summarized, when life comes at us fast, we get breathless and disoriented. Biblical and economic scholars Ched Myers and Elaine Enns, who last weekend led the Interfaith Scholar Weekend, shed some light on how people in this culture ended up with an extreme stress in their lives. With an abundance of examples, they pointed out, and I quote, "Advertising is by far the most powerful and ubiquitous voice we experience in our culture. Advertisers prey," now that's P-R-E-Y, "advertisers prey on desire and anxiety," end quote. All of us are bombarded with messages of want, that's desire, and uncertainty, that's anxiety. Maybe you never thought about advertising as being part of the problem for your stress. But the human struggle with anxiety, stress, and overwhelm date back a long time, at least back to the time when Jesus was on earth. All voices and even all disciplines seem to agree that this experience is universal. Jesus addresses it with the examples and stories in the text that Robin read for us. He begins, if you noticed, with one of two if statements. It goes like this: if you decide for God, living a life of God worship, and so on. This first if is about who. If this is you, then what follows pertains to you. For those who've decided for God, Jesus says there's another option. For those who've decided for God, they can then be called and answer the call not to fuss. Other translations say, don't worry. But thankfully, he doesn't leave it there, because we know that simply deciding not to think something and to be a certain way doesn't make it so. He says, don't fuss, but rather consider. Look at the birds. Look at the flowers. And thank you, Steve, for introducing that so well this morning with your music. In other words, change your focus. The next if statement is followed by a then statement. If this, then that. If God gives such attention to wildflowers, then don't you think God will attend to you, take pride in you, offer you the best? Jesus' call here is to redirect his hearers' focus, and at the same time to assure them that God is for them. Will the war in Ukraine spread to engulf the entire world in nuclear war? What will the effect of the world's largest iceberg breaking off of Antarctica's ice shelf be? Will the price of gas continually climb? What about inflation? And how can I, one person in one community, make a difference in all of these world problems, even in the problems in our community? And much more personally, will I pass the final exam? Or will my test results show a severe medical problem? And if so, what then? Am I becoming insignificant? Even replaceable as I age? And really close to home, what will our church community feel and look like with Robin not here? Or for Robin, what would it feel and look like as I enter the next phase? This is us. These and so many more worries flood our minds every day and sometimes in the night. We don't have to pretend that we're above that and that we successfully deal with anxiety and stress all of the time. We never feel overwhelmed. We can admit, yes, anxiety does, and it can overwhelm us. What we can also do is to be more intentional in our responses. Jesus calls us to consider, to redirect our focus, to be consciously aware of the birds that sing at daybreak, and of the wildflowers that adorn the roadsides. I would have loved one of the pictures of your backyard, Steve and Michelle. But isn't that part of the reason why we go and search for wildflowers? Or why we have houseplants? Or all manner of green and blossoming things in our yards? We know that somehow nature contributes to our well-being. Intuitively, we know that nature regenerates. But how and why? To consider means to stop, to invite the mystery of nature to flood our souls. This in and of itself is already healing. And going further, Jesus encourages his hearers to take note that not one of nature's wonders contributes to its own splendor. Not one. This is remarkable when we compare it to how humans behave. We humans, we twist and we turn and we evaluate. We're kind of like pretzels, dreading a coming event, and then tied up in knots as that event is happening. And then we take all kinds of time debriefing after that event to see what just happened. Medical researcher Dr. John J. Ratey gives the example of a zebra which grazes peacefully on the eastern African grasslands when suddenly a predator threatens its life. Now the zebra is a swift runner, so he darts away and outpaces the predator. And immediately following the chase, what does the zebra do? Continues grazing. Humans, says Dr. Ratey, would handle this very differently. Humans would debrief the predator's approach and then relive and rate the chase and begin to put into place things that would keep us more vigilant for the next time. Bottom line, be more like zebras. Since our cognition is different from zebras, we can train ourselves to think differently, to think a little bit more like zebras. So after shifting our focus away from what causes us anxiety, Jesus gives examples of kinder thinking. God will attend to you. God offers you the best. God takes pride in you. Jesus goes on to say, what I'm trying to do here is to get you to relax, to not be so preoccupied with getting that you can't respond to God's giving. I'm definitely not here to urge you to dismiss serious psychological or medical conditions which require professional treatment or intervention. Always, always take advantage of those. But we have in this text examples of how God can also play into our overall well-being. Steep your life in God reality, God initiative, God provisions, Jesus says. Brian McLaren writes, our anxiety often shows us how little we trust God. God must be either so incompetent or uncaring that we might end up miserable or starving or naked or dead. So we worry and we worry. Changing our responses to anxiety takes time. It takes mindfully deciding to stop, to refocus, to give ourselves different messages, messages that build a road so that stress and anxiety doesn't have to lead to overwhelm and overload. This can also be us. This whole season is about change. Living in and through a global pandemic has brought about monumental changes. Grief and loss continue to bring about change. Endings and beginnings bring change. Living in the past or worrying about the future is stressful and can be overwhelming. Even change that is delightful is stressful because it requires us to readjust. When anxiety and stress and overload play off of each other, resulting in a life that spins out of control and begins to suffocate us, that's when we experience an unholy Trinity. Unholy doesn't always mean the opposite of sacred. It also means unpleasant. Understood this way, we can most definitely say that too often we experience anxiety and stress and overload as very unpleasant and therefore a very unholy Trinity in our lives. Living in this moment is key. It's also hard. The final words of our text can help us with this. Give your entire attention to what God is doing right now. And don't get worked up about what may or may not happen tomorrow. God will help you deal with whatever hard things come up when the time comes. Not meant as a pat answer, but rather as words coming directly from Jesus, whom we've come to trust and follow. I now offer these words back to all of us, individually, as a faith community, to you, Robin, to every friend, to every family member. May we all experience this. Amen.